Welcome, my friend, to the On the Blue Line podcast with Wayne Mulder. I am your host, Wayne Mulder, and this is a law enforcement podcast where we discuss topics that will empower you on and off the job. Maybe you're tired or frustrated, feeling overworked, struggling to balance work and home life demands, or simply maybe you just need some encouragement. Well, you've come to the right place. Be sure to listen all the way to the end of today's podcast to learn this week's guest's favorite morning routine, what it was like growing up with a dad in law enforcement, the primary way military lieutenants used to die, and the 3 gut punches that led to a life-changing revelation. I think you're going to really enjoy this. If this is the first time that you're finding us, we have 2 weekly podcasts. This one that you're watching is The Interview Room. This is the weekly interview show that releases every Thursday at 0500, and I sit down with guests from all walks of life, not only cops, but someone who can offer us something beneficial for our personal or professional lives. And then the other podcast is called Morning Roll Call, releases every Monday at 0500, and is a weekly monologue show where you and I, we just sit down and we discuss the news, recent events, law enforcement trends, and a variety of other topics that gives you something to consider as you begin your work week. For this upcoming week, I'll be talking a little bit about my trip out west. You can see I am wearing the Wyoming hat. If you are watching us on YouTube or on Rumble, just know that we are on video on both of those. And the podcast, both of them are available pretty much on any podcast platforms or streaming services that are out there. And for more on all of it, you can always go to ontheblueline.com. Something I just wanted to mention this week, you're going to be seeing some changes, maybe a little bit different intros, a little bit different focus with some of the conversations. Nothing drastic. If you've been along for the journey this long, I'm sure you're going to enjoy everything that's coming. But there will be some changes and updates. I'm working with some great guys that are giving some ideas and some feedback on some things we can do to improve the show. So the most important thing to me is you, the listener. What can I do to improve it for you? So as you see these changes, as you see the focus, or even anything that you have now, I would love to get your feedback. Never hesitate to reach out. You can reach out via social media. You can reach out via DMs. You can reach out via email. Really, the only thing that stops you from reaching out is you, because there are a million different ways, and all of that is at On the Blue Line, ontheblueline.com as well. So let me go ahead and tell you about this week's guest. Erick Rheam is a speaker and published author. He communicates and educates on topics related to discovering significance and the art of mastering human dynamics to achieve success. He spent the past decade training and educating athletes, entertainers, business leaders, public officials, and association executives on how to build value-added customer service programs, create culture, and gain organizational buy-in. That may sound like a business topic. However, everything we discuss is 100% applicable to what you and I are doing in the law enforcement world. So I encourage you to listen to it. He's worked in the public power industry. He is a speaker, and he graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1995 with a Bachelor of Science degree in engineering. He served as a military police officer in the United States Army in Bosnia and Europe. And another key part of this interview that's specific to this audience is the fact that his dad was a police officer for 40 years and the chief of police for 8 of those years. And we talk a lot about growing up in a law enforcement family and how this really shaped his own career aspirations and who he became, and the career that is amazing that he has had as well. So without taking any more time, here's this week's guest, Erick Rheam. All right. Well, Erick, welcome to the show.
Hey, Wayne, it's a pleasure to be here. I was just telling you before we jumped on, this is my last thing of the week. It's been a busy week, man. And this is going to be fun, man. I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks for the opportunity to hang with you.
Absolutely. I'm glad this is a way that we can bookend it. So let's get to, I always start with these kind of get to know you questions, break the ice questions. And I start extremely simple. Is it coffee or tea for you?
Oh, coffee, man. I like black coffee. I like truck stop coffee, and I like to have like stuff in it I can't identify. I don't know why it is, but I like bad, nasty coffee. I think it reminds me of the military, but it's easy. It's simple. If you have that expectation with your coffee, you can pretty much drink anything. So
I agree 100%. And I find the military seems to be a common denominator, though I was not in the service. I spent my summers on Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and the crunchier, the better sometimes with when it comes to coffee. So let me ask you, do you have a favorite place to have that drink? Like a place that's peaceful for you, or just a way that you reset when you have that cup of coffee?
Yeah, I have a routine routine, man. Every day I wake up at 5:15 a.m. to start my day. I get my workout in. After I get my workout, the first thing I do is I read. I read the Bible 30 minutes a day. It's just something I find it kind of grounds me. And I have what is called athletic greens. I don't know if you've heard of that or not, but it's highly potent. So I drink that first after that first 30 minutes. And then when that's done, then my next part of my routine is I prospect for my speaking business for an hour. And that's when I open up my coffee. And so I sip that cup of coffee usually on the back deck with the water fountain going and the birds chirping, and using my Labrador and my Doberman laying at my feet as I'm reaching out to potential prospects that want to hire me as a speaker. I'm a professional speaker. And for that hour, I'm sipping on that coffee in my Ember mug to keep it hot. Don't judge me, okay? But I got an Ember mug. My wife got it for me for Father's Day. It changed my life. So that thing stays hot for an hour while I'm sipping on it. It's fantastic.
And does it maintain the quality? I have to ask, like, this is a whole rabbit trail here, but does it maintain the quality? Because I've looked at those and yeah, okay, they're a little foo-foo, but I've been a little concerned as to whether or not it maintains the quality as well as the heat.
Well, Wayne, we've already established I don't care about quality, right? I like bad coffee, so it doesn't really matter to me. But the main thing is I like it hot. I'm not a big fan of cold coffee. I don't like iced coffee. I want my coffee to be hot. And so that's the main thing. It keeps it hot, and that's all that matters.
I love it. Let me ask you, Eric, do you have a best or worst travel story?
Oh my gosh, I travel a lot. Yes, I do have a really bad one. You have kids, Wayne?
I do. He's 20 years old, though.
Okay. Yeah, but he was a baby at one point, right? So
believe it or not.
Yeah. So we were flying back from actually a business trip, my wife and I, exhausted with my daughter. My daughter was young enough where we didn't have to buy a plane ticket for her, so she was under 2. And as the plane was about to take off, she had a major diarrhea attack. I'm talking about the kinds that kind of go up her back type of stuff. And she couldn't stop. And so luckily they let my wife go in and change her, but she just kept having these diarrhea attacks. We ran out of diapers. We had no more diapers. And so literally we was doing whatever we could. And there was like baby diarrhea all over us. We smelled, the whole plane smelled. It was exhausting. We got home and we had a Labrador retriever. Cheyenne was her name, 104 pounds, beautiful brown chocolate lab. And we had hired somebody to watch her, and we mixed up the times. And the lady that was watching her thought we were coming home at a one time and we were coming home at a different time. So she didn't realize that. We didn't know that. And so she left our dog in the house for like 30 hours without letting her out. Oh, no. And so our dog pooped all over the house. All right. Yeah. And she ate it because she knew she was wrong. And then she threw it up all over the house. So we got home at 2 a.m. We smelled of baby poop. We were exhausted. We opened up and it looked like a murder scene that someone had like just spread like dog poo all over the house. It smelled. And at 2:30 in the morning, I was trying to find any place that was open that I could rent a carpet cleaner to clean up this mess. It was an exhausting experience. And even to this day, and when I see a baby, I'm like, it's good that they have that baby and I don't have that baby. So that was a pretty bad one.
That qualifies as probably the worst travel story that I've ever heard, asking that question in 50 some episodes.
That's awesome.
Wow. So let me ask you, Eric, do you have a favorite modern nonfiction book?
A favorite modern nonfiction book probably would be Thinking for a Change by John Maxwell. I love that book. It never really dawned on me that thinking is a skill set. And he just kind of walked through the fact that we just kind of forgotten how to think as a society. And this is really written before a lot of the social media stuff. So he was already on that bandwagon way before everybody says now we're a society just never thinks anymore. But he's talked about the art and science behind just thinking. And it really kind of set me on this path that I do need to have more quiet time. I need to be more deliberate about how I think and how I deliberate and think about the future. So that's probably my favorite.
Okay, good stuff. Well, let's go ahead. We'll segue into, I'd love to hear kind of your origin story, your beginning. I know you were a runner at one point, and I just kind of love to hear the beginning for you.
Yeah. Well, I think you and I were talking about this. You have kind of a really cool audience that I have a really strong connection with because I grew up in a law enforcement family. And I think that's where I'd like to really start because, I was, when I was growing up, I was at 9 years old. I remember my dad, he was a police officer. So he started out in Saratoga, New York, and he started out as a police officer. He was actually in the Air Force in Saratoga, and he just was fascinated by police work, and they were understaffed, this police department in Saratoga. And this is like the 1960s. And so my dad would volunteer to be a police officer on his off time. This is back in the day where you just do stuff like this, right? And so he would walk the beat in the 60s and loved it. And he loved the adrenaline at going into a bar and just fighting people that needed to be taken care of. He loved that. I don't know what it was. He just loved that conflict, I guess. And so he really enjoyed that, and then decided that he would apply for my mom. When they had my sister, my mom wanted to go back home, which is Indiana, which you and I are both from. And so there was a spot open in Anderson, Indiana. My mom and dad had never been there before. My mom's from Swayze. My dad's from Gas City, Indiana, Van Buren. And so anyway, so my dad applied for the job, and part of it was you had to know the city. So my dad went there with my mom, and for a weekend they drove all around the city, memorizing the streets, just figuring it all out. And he started pumping a lot of iron. He just realized he's going to have to get big and strong. So he was a big, strong guy. And so that's what started his journey as a police officer. He got hired on at the Anderson Police Department. And then I was born several years later in 1973. And then in 1983, as a 9-year-old, I'd watch my dad come in from work. He'd take off his police uniform. I'd watch him go off, put on his uniform, go out and fight crime. He might have been a superhero in my 9-year-old eyes, right? Yeah. I had a lot of respect for him. And so he came back, took off his uniform, and then he would put on his street clothes. He would have dinner, and then he'd go back out at night in the cover of darkness, Wayne, and he would paint parking lots all night long. When you go shopping at the grocery store, the lines, the parking spaces. Yep. My dad did that. It was Rheam's striping service. So my dad was a serial entrepreneur because, as you know, as law enforcement, you're not going to be rich being a law enforcement officer. Law enforcement officers and firefighters are probably the most serial entrepreneurs that I've been around, right? And so they always got side businesses and stuff like that. My dad was a mall cop, so he was Paul Blart before Paul Blart was Paul Blart. So he did that. He was a security at a country club. He owned a hairstyling salon. He owns 15 cottages up at Barbie, not too far from Fort Wayne, where you're from. And so I just grew up watching my dad just try to make ends meet. So I didn't see much of him. But as a young boy, I yearned to be with my father, to connect with my dad. But what my dad also did, what was fascinating, was he also ran. So he ran all the time. So he was always running. I mean, he would go out and run 10, 15, 20 miles. He was just this hard charging, full of energy, and part of that was he just became a runner. And the funny thing about this is that the reason why he became a runner, your law enforcement guys will get a kick out of this. The reason why he became a runner is he was actually captain of the police department. He'd risen pretty quickly in the department, and the new party came in. So it was all Democrats, and the Republicans came in, and they took all the folks that they thought were Democrats and they pushed them in third shift and did that. It's just kind of how politics works in some departments. And so my dad got moved. He lost his rank for captain, and it ticked him off, and they made him patrolman. And my dad said, he said, someday I will be chief of police. And he was just angry. So the way he dealt with that anger and that energy he had was he started running because he couldn't do anything else. He was stuck on third shift as a patrolman. So he had to do something with that energy. So he became a runner. And so I used to watch my dad run all the time. And so one day I told my dad, I said, there's this race every Thursday in Anderson called the Thursday night bike race or bike trail race. And so it was 50 cents, 1982 to get in. And I asked my dad if I could get in it, only because I wanted to run with him and let him know that I was a runner, just because I wanted to spend time with my dad. Yeah. And he said, nah, you don't need to do this, son. You ain't going to like this. And I'm like, please, Dad, let me do it. So he paid for it. I ran in the race and he finished, and I finished not too far behind him. I had Chuck Taylor Converse on. I finished not too far behind him. And my dad's like, he had to cut the course. He was asking all his friends, did my son cut the course? I was like, no, he did good. So my dad took me to the YMCA up to the fourth floor. There's a little track up there. It was hot. It was like 26 laps for a mile. And he had me run the mile, and he came back, and I remember telling my mom, he goes, I think our son's for real. And that started really a lifelong yearning and affinity for running, where my dad and I started to run together, and we ran thousands of miles together, and it worked. My dad and I really became really close. We connected with one another. We ran in races. It'd be Thursday night races. We'd run the Thursday night runs. And then every weekend on Saturday, we'd run 10Ks. Back in the 80s, they didn't have 5Ks, right? The 5Ks were for the losers that couldn't run. They were called the fun run, and nobody ran those. You ran 10Ks. That's what we did back in the 80s. And so my dad and I raced together, and then I started running marathons with him. I'd run the last 6 miles. And that's really what started the connection between my dad and I. And when up to that point, I was really distant with him, and we became really close. And so that started that connection where my dad was my hero, my best friend. someone I looked up to, and a guy that I just saw as a law enforcement officer. And it started my love for police officers because I saw what they did for the communities and I saw what my dad did. I mean, many times at Christmas time, he would come home and he would watch me open up my gifts and he'd go back out to cover a homicide. That was our life. And so I was just used to that. And I was also used to getting death threats. One time acid was dropped on our cars because somebody didn't like my dad and they got out of prison and came to get revenge. And we'd have to have policemen, especially when my dad was chief of police, sit outside our house because we'd get threats all the time. And, just being around that, but also seeing the brotherhood. I remember at Christmas time, Santa Claus would come at the FOP. And I remember sitting on Santa Claus' lap, which was some policeman that drew the short straw, and sit on the lap and get some kind of cool gift. And just seeing this brotherhood, it just struck me as a young kid that these people were so close. And I just wanted to have that in my life, which is what kind of took me down the military and ultimately military police. So that's kind of the start of this whole thing.
That's great. There's so many questions I have in there. I love it. So was it always a positive thing for you? I find this is a conversation. In fact, Father's Day a year ago, I actually had my son on the podcast because I wanted to get his perspective as a 20-year-old now. And the times have changed from the 80s, obviously, to the 2000s. Yeah. So was it always a positive thing? Was it always one of respect and, hey, it's cool, my dad's a cop? Or was there ever a period of time at school and so forth where there was kind of a negative connotation to it for you?
Not back then. It was a very honorable profession, I think, and still considered. I don't know what it's like now, but I mean, it was considered very honorable profession. I always was proud that my dad was a police officer. I remember when it was bring your dad to school. I thought it was cool. My dad came in his uniform, and all my friends thought my dad was cool. He came in with his handcuffs and his gun, and that was fascinating. I was proud that my dad looked sharp. He really made it. He took a lot of pride in the way he looked. He was part of the what do you call it, the motorcycle, and he would do parades and stuff like that. His stuff always looked shiny. He always represented really well. And something my dad did that I didn't realize now until I was a father, he didn't really let on a lot of the stress that he was feeling. I mean, he covered some pretty bad cases and covered some of the stories he tells me pretty horrific that he had to deal with. He never brought that home. He never talked about it, that kind of thing. He protected us from that. And so I didn't find out about a lot of that stuff till later, which I always admired him about. He didn't scream and yell. I mean, my mom and dad had a pretty volatile relationship, but that was just because they were both type A, high energy. I do think sometimes the stress of being a law enforcement it reared its ugly head when Dad and I would get in fights sometimes when I was going through my teenage years. I look back at it. I think he was just stressed out more than anything. He was exhausted. He didn't get a lot of sleep. And so he would get set off very easily. And so we'd go toe to toe. One time when he was chief of police, we had an all out brawl, and my dad said, all right, I'll meet you outside. He was going to beat the crap out of me basically. And I went out back and I grabbed my bike, and he let the air out of my tires because he knew I was going to try to escape. He's going to wallop me basically. And so my mom picked up the phone to call the police, and the police called because I knew it was a chief's calling. And she said, my husband's about to kill my son. And the police called, and my dad picked up and he goes, this is Chief Ron Rheam. I got it covered. Don't worry about it. And hung up, and the police never came, and we figured it out, And so, those things happen. So I think that part, yes. But as far as the community, just regular people, my dad was in the newspaper a lot. One time he actually, as a chief of police, he wasn't paying attention, and he went through a stop sign and he hit an old woman, and that made and she survived. I mean, everything like that. But my dad had to leave town because he was the butt of the jokes, and he had to send her flowers. And so little things like that. Where our house burned down one time at Christmas time, and the first thought was that somebody burned it down on purpose, which is kind of sad, right? That's what their first thought was, that it was arson, and that made the front page. But it turned out it was my dad that actually burned the house down accidentally, and so he was just an idiot. That's why it happened. But my point was that was just something we were used to. That whenever something happens, small town, chief of police, that kind of thing, there was a bad side of the town where that was a negative because they were just bad people, right? And bad people didn't like my dad, and so sometimes they would try to do bad things. But regular people, I think they honored him. They honored our family. They looked up to my dad that he would willing to do those kind of things. And the whole community really supported the police officers. It was kind of a prideful thing to be a part of the police department back then.
Yeah, no, I could definitely see that even growing up. a little bit younger, where in the 80s I was much younger, but the same thing with the local law enforcement and so forth up there in that part of Indiana where I'm from. It's just changed, where back then it really was. There was a certain amount of respect and a whole lot less interaction. It was shocking to me coming to Florida and then coming into law enforcement and just seeing the amount of interaction people have with law enforcement. I mean, in Indiana, it was more of a, obviously if an emergency happened, you called them, but outside of that, like everything wasn't an emergency. Nowadays, it seems like people call 911 for I've fixed people's sprinklers before when they called 911. So it's literally everything.
Yeah. I tell you, one of the things I really thought was interesting when I was growing up, just from the outside in watching things, is that in the police department, they had a love-hate, right? Where they loved each other, but they hated each other like brothers. And so I just remember when my dad as chief, and he'd get so mad at his assistant chiefs, he would throw chairs against the wall, and they would just have these brawls, like just getting each other's face like this, and then love each other right after that. I just don't see that in regular work environments, but in the police department, it was nothing to see that. And I remember like my dad, when I was born, he told me the whole police department, you couldn't even see because there was so much smoke because everybody was lighting up cigars. Ron Rheam's son just had a birth of his son in 1973. That was back when they didn't do ultrasounds. You didn't know what the sex was until it came out. So they came out, and my dad was so glad he had a son. He called my grandmother and was crying. My grandmother thought something happened and I died because he was so happy. And he took cigars to the police department. Everybody lit it up, right? Yeah. And it was, what is interesting to me is I remember how the policemen took care of each other's kids too. And so whenever I got myself in trouble or something happened, another police officer would come and he knew who I was and he would take care of me and for my dad and then get back with my dad later. I've always felt like I could go to any police officer because I knew they were like brothers and they would take care of me if I needed something. I really loved that security blanket. That was that fraternity. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And so important. That's awesome. Now, in your own journey, then at some point you end up at West Point, correct? Now, were you hoping to run in college? Was that your intention, or?
Yeah. Well, that starting running with my dad, that really started my whole career in running. And it turned out that I was actually halfway decent at it, to the point that by my senior year, I had several Division I full ride scholarship offers from all over the country. And there was a couple of programs I was interested in, really was West Point and Navy. And so United States Military Academy and United States Naval Academy, both were vying for me. Army had one of the top 5 running programs in the country at the time. So they had one of the top guys from California, one of the top guys from Pennsylvania, New York. They had one of the top guys from Kentucky, from Georgia, Alabama. And then they wanted me, this guy from Indiana. And so I was honored that they were even considering me. And it was funny because I was fast, but I was just an average student, 3.5 grade point average, like maybe 1,100 SATs. That's not even close to being acceptable at West Point. I didn't even have a nomination from a senator. Nobody wanted to nominate me. So West Point called me up and said, listen, we're thinking you need to go to prep school. And I said, I'm not going to do that. Navy's calling me every day. I'm sure they'll figure something out. And they said, well, let me get back with you, is what they said. And so this is a true story. The day later, Congressman Dan Burton's assistant called me and said, please hold for Dan Burton, Congressman Burton. He gets on the phone. He says, all right, you did a good job on your interviews. I'm going to go ahead and nominate you. And I said, cut the crap, sir. Did the coach call you from West Point? He goes, yes, he did. And don't embarrass me. That's what he said. So the head coach at West Point called up the congressman and said, we want this guy, whatever you got to do, let's make it happen. And then West Point flew me out and had me take the ACT because I had to get a acceptable score. So I did that. And then Navy called and said, before you make a decision, come out to us first. And I said, nah, I'm going to Army. And they said, okay. Excuse my language, but they said, we're going to kick your ass for the next 4 years is what Navy said. And it turned out not to be true. We beat the crap out of them for the next 4 years. So that's what started my career at West Point. And I went there to run. Basically, I was interested in the military because my dad was Air Force. I remember one day as a young man, my dad and I were driving by Fort Wright-Patterson. I guess what it's called in Ohio. And I remember looking at all the military compound and being fascinated. And I started asking my dad about it. And he started telling me a little bit about what it takes to get in the military and that kind of stuff. And I thought that might be nice. And so when West Point started calling on me, that's when I realized, okay, maybe this is a good win-win. I can be a part of a good running program and then go on to the military. So that's why I decided to do that.
Very good. Yeah. Very, very cool. So eventually that leads to military police. And from there you talk about in your writings, and we'll get to your book, Rise Above Chaos, but in your story, you talk about some setbacks or some failures that eventually, in a lot of ways, became a starting point for you. So can you kind of walk us into that moment and what some of those were and what the world was like for you in that time?
Yeah. Well, reason why I went military police is when you, at the academy, you have to pick like 1 through 16. I think it was 16, your number one choice all the way down to your 16th choice as far as what branch of service you want to go through. And so I was really trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And it really came down to armor, which is tanks, or military police. And ultimately I decided to go military police for a couple of reasons. One, my dad was a police officer. I kind of wanted to honor him a little bit with that. But also military police is interesting because some of the sharpest folks that come into the Army, they put them in military police, because in order to be a law enforcement, especially in the military, you have to think really well on your feet. You got to be pretty sharp, right? You just can't be some dumb grunt that can hold a weapon and point and shoot. You actually got to be able to think and make decisions. And so they put a lot of high IQ folks in military police. And I thought, well, I'd like to work with a lot of people who are sharp. And the military police makes up 3% of the Army, but they're involved in 98% of the missions. Everywhere there's a mission with the military, there's always law enforcement there with it. So I thought, well, that's a good way to experience the military. So that's what I did. And so then you had to choose where you want to go. So based on your class rank, my class rank was high enough. I was able to get my top choices. So I put Germany. I thought it'd be fun to go to Europe. Well, what I did think about is when I went there, Bosnia was pretty hot right there. So in the mid 90s, Bosnia Herzegovina was like World War II level genocide, Wayne. And we're talking like, basically if you were the wrong religion, didn't matter if you were man, woman, or child, you were executed, murdered, your whole family. They'd murder your daughter, your kids right in front of you. I mean, just saying it sounds weird just saying it, but man, it was like happening. And so much so the world could no longer look the other way. And so we had to do something about it. So they formed together, all of our allies started Operation Joint Endeavor. And my first state duty station was in Bosnia as a platoon leader, leading 33 men and women into harm's way in the country that's about the size of Alabama with over 3 million undocumented landmines. We didn't shower for like 2 months. When we got there was no running water. I was 23 years old. I mean, it was a very high stress environment. And I was like, man, I'm not sure if I can do this. I remember when I got there, within the first like 24 hours, we got called out on a mission and I was just bad. I was stumbling all over myself. I could tell my soldiers were looking at me and they were kind of like law enforcement. When you're the new guy, you're the new captain, new sergeant, new shift supervisor. People are looking at you like, do I even respect this guy? And I can see it in their eyes. And so I remember after that mission was over, I went somewhere where nobody could see me and I just bawled, man. I cried. I was like, there's no way I can do this. I'm not equipped. I'm not ready for this. And luckily there was this operations sergeant. His name was Tuli Malolulu. He looked like The Rock. Okay. So just picture that, but with hair. He's big. He's Samoan. He had calves that were bigger than my body. He had these really deep age lines in his face of a white life well lived. He had dark coal eyes that were sunken into his skull. I didn't know he had teeth because he never smiled. He was the op sergeant, and he just ate my lunch all the time. Just got on me. I was scared of this guy, and this guy was huge. But he lived. He didn't stay in the tents with everybody else. He had his own little tent on this hillside. It's like a movie setting, right? Yeah. He was on the hillside, and every night I'd see his little fire up there. He's like, what the hell is he doing up there? He had a slingshot he was like proficient at, and he would hunt with a slingshot. He would hunt these wild boar with a slingshot. This guy was phenomenal. He's the kind of guy that if something went down, you want him on your side. You know what I'm saying? I mean, he would take out a lot of people. And so one day I decided I wanted to go up and talk to him because I respected him. And I went up to him and I said, Sergeant Malolulu, can I talk to you? And he goes, yeah, come in. And he was different when it was just me and him. He softened his tone a little bit. He was gentle. He even smiled. And he kind of took me under his wing. And I just blurted out to him and said, I don't know what I'm doing, Sergeant. You got to help me out here. And he goes, listen, you're talented. Trust me. You know what you're doing. He says, you just got to take a deep breath, trust your non-commissioned officers, and you're going to be fine. They're not going to let you fail. And so that started where I'd go there every night and go to his tent, and he would just speak wisdom over me and just teach me all this stuff. And in the public setting, he still ripped my lunch in front of people. It was kind of a role I had to play. He kind of used me as an example with the other lieutenants, but behind closed doors, he kind of taught me the ropes of what it meant to be a soldier, what it meant to be a leader. And that's really kind of what got me back on track. And by the time we redeployed back to Germany, I was rated the top lieutenant in my battalion. And whenever there were high-end missions, my platoon, the Wolfpack platoon, was the first platoon the battalion commander would always call on. But it all started with me finding a mentor that was willing to sit down with me and kind of explain to me what it's going to take for me to survive this situation. Because we're dealing with real world.
Right.
If you think about like back in Vietnam and all these times we were in conflict as a country, lieutenants, and I was lieutenant then, the primary way lieutenants died was getting shot in the back. Most of the time, lieutenants were shot by their own soldiers. And so if you think about, you're dealing with situations that, you're being mixed with people from all walks of life. I had a guy in my platoon that practiced voodoo. I had a Las Vegas stripper in my platoon. I had gang members in my platoon. I had white, black, Chinese, all kinds, right? All put in this one together. We all had weapons with live ammunition. At any time, any person could take their weapon off safe and just start laying into people, right? So that's just real world, man. You got to gain someone's respect when they're looking at you and they've got an M16 that's loaded, like you got an M16 that's loaded, and all around you is landmines. And if you step in the wrong direction, you get your toe blown off, your leg blown off, and just all that together, you had to figure out, how am I going to survive? It really taught me a lot about just the bare bones of humanity and how you can survive. It was an unbelievable situation.
That's absolutely fascinating. You talk about this idea of the beast. What does that mean? What are you referring to there?
Yeah. So fast forward, to many years after that, I got out of the military and I actually got in the utility world. I got in the utility world because of a girl. Have you ever done anything stupid in the name of love before, Wayne?
I think most guys have, actually.
Yeah. Well, that was me. And so I met this girl. Her name's Aaliyah. She was in Anderson, where I'm from, but I didn't live there anymore. I was in Colorado. I met her actually at my sister's funeral, which is a fun, weird thing, but I met her there. She was the mayor's daughter, right? She was 7 years younger than me. I never met her before. And for whatever reason, she went with the mayor because they wanted to pay the respects of her dad was the mayor. My dad was the chief of police. They wanted to pay the respects to our family, and she decided to go. And we laid eyes on each other the very first time in front of my sister's casket. And I realized that, man, she was sharp. She was sharp, and I knew that I was kind of interested in her. Well, she had a boyfriend at the time. Ironically, he was a West Pointer and I was a captain in the Army at the time. And so I realized he was in New York. I was in Colorado. She was in Anderson, Indiana. And I thought, well, if I really think this is the one, I'm just going to have to move to Anderson. So that's what I did. I moved to Anderson, took a job with utility. My dad, by that time, was no longer the chief of police. He was the Board of Works chairman. And so he told me I could get the job if I wanted it. So I took the job, and then it worked. Within 5 months, Aaliyah and I were engaged. 9 months later, we were married. Okay. That was 2001. We moved to Colorado in 2005, and I really hit rock bottom. I just kind of lost my way, man. I think this happens with a lot of people, law enforcement or not. I mean, you just get in a phase where you're just trying to figure things out. And I just was not living up to the standard I needed to live up to. And my wife called me out on it. And so in 2005, I had 3 gut punches. One is my wife looked at me, and this hurt me. She said, Eric, you're not living up to my expectations. Her eyes were bloodshot. She's like, you're not what I expected from a husband. And that hurt, man, because she was fantastic and she chose me to be her husband, and I was letting her down, and she was my best friend. And that hurt. That was a gut punch. The second one was my dad. My dad, when my kids were born in 2005, Wayne, my dad came out with my mom, my twin boys, to be with us, to be with his grandchildren, and to spend time with me. They were scheduled to stay 10 days. After 2 days, my dad and I got into a big fight. I laid my hands on my dad in anger, and I threw him out of my house. It was probably one of the lowest moments in my life with my father. And he just left. He packed up his bags and flew home, and we didn't talk for 6 months. My dad was the best man at my wedding. I've already explained to you what he meant to me, and I couldn't believe that I did that. Have you ever had that outer body experience where you just been so mad and Absolutely. You see yourself doing something you were going to regret, but you can't help it because you're just mad? And that's what happened. So that was gut punch number 2. And then gut punch number 3, I was suspended from work because I just got out of the military. I was treating my colleagues like soldiers, and they weren't having any of it. And they basically were saying I was abusing my power. Well, I had energy, I had talent, but I just lacked self-awareness. I just expected you to get the job done. I didn't care about your personal problems and all this and that. And I just wasn't treating people correctly. And so the human resources manager said, hey, take a week off on unpaid leave. And so I found myself in a dark place, man. I found I was just not living where I needed to live. So on that first day of suspension, I told my wife I'm going to go out for a while. I got cleaned up and got dressed and got in my car and I just drove. And I found myself in a small little town called Niwot, Colorado. It's about 15 minutes outside of Boulder, about 45 minutes outside of where we lived, far enough where I could think about my life, but close enough if my wife needed me, she could call me. And so I began to think about, I went to this coffee shop. Niwot, Colorado is this beautiful little hallmark little town. It's gorgeous. And so I parked and I went inside this little coffee shop right downtown, got a cup of coffee, sat right next to the window and just sipped that coffee for 7 hours, Wayne, and just thought about my life. In fact, I went there every day for 7 days. By the end of it, those baristas thought I was weird. Like this guy comes in, he gets one cup of coffee and he sits there. And so I just sat there and I began to ask myself, what's the problem? It seems like every time I get any momentum in my life, I do something stupid to just destroy it. And I had this destructive lifestyle that I just couldn't get out of. And so I began to realize that there was this unknown force that was always there. It was whispering, I'm not good enough, or you're not good enough for her, or why didn't you get that promotion? It kept me up at night and it was just always in the back of my mind. And so being from a military background, I recognize it's an enemy. It's an unknown force, but it's an enemy. And I identified it and I started to call it something. And so by the end of the week, I just started calling it the beast. And I realized that the beast is something that we all deal with, that negative voice that you just can't get out of your mind. And it was in the shotgun of my life. I mean, if I was driving a car, it was riding shotgun and it was dominating my life. And so I realized that something needed to change, that I had to tame it. And so I was determined by the end of that week, by the time that suspension was over, I realized that although I was at a rock bottom of my life, that I still had my wife, I still had my dad, and I still had my job. But if I was going to do anything about it, something needed to change. And the first thing was I needed to tame that beast. And that's what started that journey.
Wow. Very powerful. And I think it's something that we all find these areas, even as you were talking and kind of sharing these vignettes of your life and of these moments. I know they were similar ones that come to me from my own relationship with my father, which I love. My father passed away last year. But we had a really good relationship. And same thing though, as you talk, I think as young men, we all go through these phases, both as teenagers and young adults and so forth. One of the things you talk about in line of talking about the beast and determining the path forward, you talk about this fear of not being relevant. And I found that, I think that's something that really does resonate with a lot of law enforcement officers too, because I think you're drawn to these careers of service because of a desire for relevance and even things like podcasting and so forth. They're a way to get your voice out there because you want to make a difference. So take me a little bit into that and what that means to you when we talk about relevance.
Yeah. So that was the second part of the equation. So the first part of the equation, I had this beast that I had to dominate, which I developed a methodology that my book talks about how to deal with that. But the other part that I realized that I was missing in my life at the time was significance. I believe that if you don't have a purpose in your life, that's a fundamental void in your heart that has to be filled with something. And that's where the beast comes in. So usually like when I was in Bosnia, when I saw people living a destructive lifestyle, like all those Bosnians, young men that were just doing bad things, most of them they had no purpose. And because of that, they filled it with something and they usually fill it with something evil. That's where the beast comes in, right? I believe each and every one of us wants to achieve some level of significance in our life, Wayne. We all want to know that our life matters at the end of the day. We want to have an impact. And I think the frustrating thing for law enforcement is you have an impact, but a lot of times you don't get the resources to do what you want to do with your life. You really pour your entire life, your blood, your sweat, your tears. My dad's got scars. He walks with a limp. He gave everything for his community, right?
Yeah.
But was he properly rewarded for that? Sometimes no, And so sometimes if we get tied up with the identity that is our job and that's it, then sometimes that can lead to a lot of destruction in our lives. So what I realized is that in order for me to cut through the whirlwind and rise above my chaos, I had to find my level of significance. And I had to unpack, well, what does that really mean? And how am I going to get there? And what steps do I need to take? And so that started on a 15-year journey where I had to figure some things out. And I found what I call the 5 principles to discover significance and live in peace. Because ultimately, everybody wants that. Law enforcement, doesn't matter who you are, but especially law enforcement, you want to know that you're having an impact. And sometimes you're not going to get the relevance or the rewards that you want to get publicly, but that's really irrelevant. There's some things that got to happen inside that you have to address, and the steps that I lay out that allows someone to find their own level of significance that makes sense for them. And so that's what I meant when I talk about relevance and why that's important.
Very good. You've mentioned, and of course, your book, Rise Above Chaos. I want to make sure the listeners get that book and go through it. But you've mentioned that some of these principles, when we talk about significance, when we talk about rising above chaos, before we get to one of the principles, let me just quickly back up and ask a question. Can you define chaos? Because we live in chaotic times, right? So when you use the term, and we're using it in the meaning of this book, how are you defining chaos, or what do you see it as the problem that is going to be addressed?
Yeah. First of all, chaos is all relevant, right? Meaning that your chaos is different than my chaos. But, because sometimes I think we can prejudge other people's chaos. Like, what's that person worried about? That's not chaotic. But if they're in their own chaos, that's their chaos, right? And so the way I define it is anytime that you're overwhelmed so much so that you're not even sure where to start. That's what chaos means to me. In fact, the military is one that first kind of clued me in on chaos. When I got to West Point, one of the first things they asked us is, do you understand what business you're about to get into? And I had no idea. And they said, as a military officer, a U.S. Army officer, you're going to be in the business of managing chaos. Right. And what they meant by that is that you're going to have the best plans, you're going to have the best weapons, you're going to have the best soldiers. But as soon as you go into that mission, that first bullet flies and someone gets hit and you start to smell blood and people start going down, chaos is going to ensue. And whether you're going to live or die or get your soldiers out of there is how you manage chaos. And the thing they taught us in the military is the way you manage chaos is usually through standard operating procedures, battle drills, but also center of gravity and understanding what your very next step is. And so what I had to figure out is that, and what I lay out in the book is when you find yourself in chaos, the main thing is you got to have kind of a true north and what your next step is. And that's why I lay out in the book, step by step, how to get yourself out of the chaos. So that's it. All that chaos is being overwhelmed and not understanding where you need to go next. And the first way to get out of it is identifying your next step and do that. And that's what we lay out in the book.
I love it. And definitely everyone needs to get the book. It's Rise Above Chaos. Could you give us one of those steps, or what you think would be the foundational? Is it just simply from the planning, like you said, or what would you say is the foundational point there?
Well, I think you just start with number one, because it's called Embrace Your Spiritual Journey. And what that means is that it's not like a religious thing, but I think all of us has a little voice inside that's always asking that question, why, right? I think why is the fundamental question that each and every one of us has to answer. Because Wayne, when you get up out of the morning, right, and you go out into the world, you're walking into a hostile world. That's just a regular human being. Yeah. But if you're a law enforcement officer, you're walking into a hostile world times 1,000, right? So if you're going to walk out into that hostile world and face the world as who you are, if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, then what's the point? If you don't know your why, the beast is going to eat you alive. Because people that don't know their why lose their way. Probably the first time I kind of started to clue in on this is I remember, we started this whole podcast conversation about my dad being an avid runner. Well, I remember it was like 83 or 84. My dad ran the Boston Marathon. And so he pulled me out of school, and it was an honor for me to go to Boston with him and watch him run that race. And I watched him run. It was fantastic. It was an unbelievable experience. But my dad never ran again after that. My dad, up to that point, even competed in the police Olympics, the International Police Olympics. He dominated. He was fantastic. He even ran so hard at the police Olympics in Austin, Texas. It was so hot. It was over like 100 degrees. Wow. He passed out. They had to take him to the emergency room and pack him in ice. And I remember they asked him, where are you from? And he said, the United States. He was delirious. And they got him back together and they put him back out there, and he ran again that night after coming back from the hospital. That's how he does life. He's just a beast. And so I watched my dad run that marathon. He never ran again. And so one day I asked my dad many years later, I said, why'd you stop running? And he told me, he said, Erick, at mile 18 of that Boston Marathon, I started to cramp. I started to feel bad. And for the first time in my running career, I stopped and I walked. And he said, during that 18th mile while I was walking, I realized that I don't care that I'm doing this anymore. Nobody cares that I'm out here. I've lost my reason for doing this. Why am I doing this? He lost his why. And so after that, he realized that running was a phase of life that helped him. During that time when he lost his captain and had to become a patrolman. By the way, here's a funny story with that is once he did make chief, he fired the consulting company that downgraded him to patrolman. That was his first thing. He's got rid of him.
Sure.
It took him like 10 years. It took him 10 years, but he came back. He said, screw you guys. You guys are out of here. You knocked me down to patrolman. Well, you just lost your job. So anyway, so he stopped doing that. And so that's when I realized that you got to know what your why is. And so for the first step, what I recommend for everybody listening to this, the main thing with why is there's two parts to it. Number one is you got to understand your passion, and your passion is what are you willing to suffer for? If you know what your passion is, that's the fuel that's going to help you rise above the chaos, right? So for me, my passion is people. I have a passion for, like you, Wayne. It's really motivating for me to meet someone new like you. It's motivating. I did a talk yesterday for 75 people I never met before. I loved it. I walked out of there with 75 friends. So that's my passion. I have a passion for people. The second part of your why is your superpower. So you're uniquely qualified, Wayne, to do something great, right? We're all uniquely qualified. You have a set of skills, Wayne, that I can't even touch. Well, once you identify what your superpower is and you line that with your passion, what happens is your why begins to formulate. And when your why formulates and you understand what your why is, then when you go out in that hostile world, you get spit on by somebody that you're trying to arrest, you get videoed by somebody who thinks they know it all, or you get suspended or whatever. It doesn't really matter, because all those things are going to happen to you. But when you know why you're doing what you're doing, you're willing to do what you're doing because you're willing to suffer because it's your passion, and you're suffering for something within your superpower that you're uniquely qualified to do. So for me, what that meant was I'm really good at communication. I have a passion for people. I align that together. And over time, I realized that I'm a speaker. And so I go out and I speak to thousands of people on a yearly basis. Some people hate me. Some people write me bad letters. Some people give me really bad surveys, and it doesn't matter, because on the other side of that is hundreds and hundreds of people that come up to me with tears in their eyes saying, you changed the way I look at the world. That's my why. So if you know your why, that's the first step for finding your significance. And I lay it out in the book on how to do that.
That is so powerful. That if the listeners get nothing else, you need to go back and rewind that and listen to that one more time. That was absolutely powerful, and that's not hyperbole. It really was great, Eric. And for the listeners, definitely check out. There's 5 principles from the book. The book is Rise Above Chaos, and it's riseabovechaosbook.com. I do want to ask you one thing that you had just mentioned. One of the things I was reading about you. You talk why the world belongs to the encourager. Just real quickly, I loved when I read that line. Mm-hmm. I think it was mentioned as maybe a possible title for a show, but why do you think the world belongs to the encourager? Because I just love that concept.
Well, because at the end of the day, if you want to live a life of significance, you can't do it without the help of others. There's no example of any man or any woman achieving any level of significance by themselves. If you're going to do anything significant, you're going to need somebody on your team. You are where you are right now, Wayne, because somebody edified you. They supported you. It could have been a coach, could have been your dad, could have been a mom, a spouse. They edified you and they supported you. You can't do this by yourself. If you're going to continue on the path of significance and success, you're going to need to surround yourself with good people. Well, here's the thing. When you're trying to connect with others, you need to be an encourager. Why? Because people remember how you make them feel at the end of the day. Nobody cares what you know or who you are. All they care about at the end of the day is how do you make them feel? How do you make them feel about you? How do you make them feel about the world? And how you make them feel about themselves? When you evaluate your relationships, you always evaluate them based on how you feel about the person. Right. That's so important. And so if you start to learn that if you can encourage others, then by doing that, you're going to attract the right people that want to be around you. And when you're an encourager, you will never be without people who want to support you and be around you, because the people like to be around others that encourage them. Now, don't mistake what I'm saying here. I'm not talking about being a cheerleader, like a rah-rah. That's not what encouragement is. Encouragement is actually through the act of sacrifice. That's how we encourage one another. As law enforcement officers, we can understand this more than anybody. We really value our fellow police officers because we sacrifice for one another, right? We sacrifice our blood, our sweat, our tears, our finances. And when you sacrifice for another human being, you form a connection that can never be broken. And so the 3 ways you sacrifice is time, money, and ego. So right now, you and I are sacrificing for one another. I'm spending an hour with you. You're spending an hour with me. We're connecting with one another, right? Yeah. And so when we spend that time together, we sacrifice. So if I spend time, like for instance, if a law enforcement officer, if it goes down and he's sick and he's hurt, spending time with his family. I've had that happen before, where when my sister died, the law enforcement community came and surrounded my dad and supported us and sat with us and cried with us. That's act of sacrifice. That is encouragement. Money, when you sacrifice money, I can't tell you how many times my dad contributed to funds for charities and stuff for maybe a law enforcement officer who died and they had kids and they need to get to college, stuff like that. That's act of sacrifice, right? And the last one is ego. How many of your listeners are better arguers after the argument's over? You know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. When you get in an argument with someone and you're just so mad at that person and you can't wait to talk to them the next day. But before you can argue with them, they look at you and they say, hey, I'm sorry what I said last night. Can you forgive me? And when someone does that, it takes the wind out of your sails, because you realize how hard it is to say you're sorry. Because when someone takes their ego and they rip it out of their chest and they lay it at your feet, that's an act of sacrifice. So here's the question for all your listeners. Do they have a relationship right now? It would change everything if that person just said they're sorry. More importantly, would it change everything if they just said they're sorry? And if we just relax a little bit and learn to sacrifice our time, money, and ego for one another, we edify and encourage one another. And then that is in itself a path to significance. It's a beautiful thing.
Absolutely, it is. Well, thank you, Erick. Let me ask you two final questions that I kind of ask everybody. What is next for you in your mission? We've talked about, obviously, you are a speaker, and a great one, by the way. And we've spoken about your book, Rise Above Chaos. But what is next for you in your mission?
Well, I have a pretty big mission. I want to help 10,000 people over the next 3 years cut through their own whirlwind so they can rise above their own chaos and discover significance. But more importantly, find peace. Peace is so important because you can find peace in your significance journey, even with chaos happening around you. And so that's what I want to do. And so what I'm doing is I traveled across the country doing keynotes and workshops, and just add as much value as I can and get this book into people's hands. I got courses I do workshops, things like that, just to help people get back on track. Because my thought is that, let's just say that more law enforcement officers go to work with their why. They go to work with their relevance in mind and peace doing what they're doing. That's huge. I've seen a lot of really good law enforcement officers go bad, mainly because they just lost their way. They lost their why. And I want to help as many of them get back on track, because I know how important our law enforcement community is, man. Let me tell you, I know what life would be like if people like my dad didn't go to work every day like he did for 40 years. And I don't want that life. And so I want to encourage as many as law enforcement officers as I can and their families to be encouraged to go out. And so if I can help 10,000 people like that in the next 3 years, then hopefully I can make a dent. And that's what I'm trying to do.
What a powerful mission. Let me ask you my last question. We've gone over so many good things. I'm not sure if there's anything left for this question, but it's the final question that I ask everybody who comes on the show. What is the one takeaway, one thing that we all can do that's going to help law enforcement officers in their personal lives? So what's that one thing that will make a difference in their personal life?
Wow, that's a good one. I think probably just acknowledge that what you're doing matters, I think would be one thing. I would tell you that as a young man, and I just want to encourage anybody that's in the law enforcement, by the way, if it's a wife that's listening to this right now, you play just as a big role as the husband or wife that is going out there and putting their life on the lines. There were many times that my mom would pick me up from school. We spent a lot. My dad even says he wished he was there more often, but my mom had to bear the brunt of my dad not being around. Right. So if you're a mom or a wife of a law enforcement officer, you play just as a bigger role, right? And I think just to understand, because I think we can get a little jaded sometimes, just going and doing the calls and doing all the things we got to do. And sometimes we forget the impact we're making, and just from my standpoint, I would tell you that my life was shaped by just watching police officers from afar. So I think it's important, every law enforcement officer, whenever you put on that uniform and you go out in your community, people are watching. And a lot of people aren't watching for the negative reasons. There's a 9-year-old boy that's watching like I did and saying, man, I value that guy is awesome. That lady's awesome. And because of that, that person may make decisions that's going to be very positive because of something they may have saw you do that you didn't even realize that you did.
Absolutely.
Just getting out of your car that looks sharp, it's clean, you look sharp, not losing your cool, being professional, things like that, that impacts. I think the community gets a lot of its cues from its law enforcement officers. You know what I'm saying? The community gets its identity from those law enforcement. They're probably, outside of maybe the fire department, they're the most visible community asset in the community. And when you go in, you notice the police cars, you notice those officers. And when they don't look sharp, that tells you a little bit about the community. So they represent the community. It's so freaking important. So never lose the fact that you are shaping people's lives and impacting people just by showing up and being who you are. So I think what I would do is acknowledge that you're making an impact and just keep showing up, because showing up matters, and we value you. I value you, and you guys, what you're doing is making a difference. So I love you guys and I appreciate you. And Wayne, it has been an absolute honor to be on this podcast. Thank you so much for what you're doing. This is making a difference, man. I appreciate it.
I greatly appreciate it. Real quick, what is the best way for people to connect with you?
I just go to my website, erickrheam.com. So ERICKRHEAM. I'm the only Erick Rheam in the world. So if you Google me, my mom, she must have been a genius. She knew that it was going to be important someday. She knew Google was going to be great. So that's how you find me.
Perfect. Well, I will be sure to link all that up. Thank you so much for coming on, Erick. This has been a blast and I appreciate your time.
That's awesome. Thanks, man.
Thank you. So thank you for watching or listening, depending on how you were accessing this week's program, to this week's podcast. Every episode, if you want to get the full show notes, you can go to ontheblueline.com. There's pictures of the guests. There's a transcription of every episode, and it's all at ontheblueline, ontheblueline.com/show notes, or you can just click down below in the show notes on whatever platform you're watching this, and that will take you directly to the show notes page on the website for this show. If I could just ask you one quick favor, if you hear a book or anything from any of the guests, or if you go to the bookstore section of the website, if there is any books that you intend to get from Amazon or from Audible, if you click that link and do it through the link that is on there, it will benefit us and it doesn't cost you anything additional. It will actually Amazon doesn't charge you anything more to use the affiliate link. And in turn, they will throw a few pennies our direction, which will help with the overall expense of bringing this to you each and every day. So that's a favor I ask, and I appreciate you considering it. That is all for today. Don't forget that I'm going to see you next Monday in Morning Roll Call. I will see you Thursday in the interview room. But in the meantime, I'll see you out there on the Blue Line.